Okay, my name is David Hunt. I work for Concept Consulting, have been helping on some aspects of RTP design. I'm going to talk today, give you just a quick overview on the topic of setting scarcity values. I'd like to begin by just using an analogy that was used at one of the earlier workshops, where RTP was described as a bit like moving from driving on the left to driving on the right. D-Day will occur sometime in 2022. A whole lot of things have to change to enable that. It's not just about saying we now drive on the right. There's a whole lot of street signs, traffic lights, all sorts of things have to be altered. In some ways, think about the setting of scarcity values as the speed limits. They are part of the change. They don't have to change at the same time, but you need some speed limits on the, in the new realm, driving on the right. And so just have that in your head as we're thinking about scarcity values. I'll start by just describing what we mean by that term. I just have to make sure I can use the technology. So someone tells me the green button. Great. It's important to recall that the values we're talking about here are not just dollars, they're also megawatt quantities. And so when we're talking about values, think dollars and megawatts. And they apply in two important situations. One, when we have energy deficits. So the scarcity values that were described back in August, we'll talk about those a bit more in a moment. And also the risk violation curves when there are instant reserve shortfalls, which will be the topic that Justin will pick up and Rama will talk a little bit more about later in the day as well. Why are they important? They have effects on a whole range of different areas. They have important operational and investment signalling effects. Although most days it's going to be bids and offers that set prices, these values sit above those things and effectively will influence directly if we have an energy shortfall or a instantaneous reserve shortfall, or indirectly through people knowing those are there sitting in the code. That in turn affects reliability. If those values were set crushingly low, you wouldn't expect there would be enough resources being offered, either demand response or supply to meet demand. On the other hand, if they were set very, very high, you could well have the opposite effect, and particularly effects on prices. So getting them right is important. If we just talk about the values, it's useful to think about three different sets of values. There are the values that are set that are in the consultation paper that's before you now, the initial values. And those have largely been set based on the existing code, the scarcity price values in the existing code. So if you like, we've taken the speed limits in the existing road code, we've put them in the proposed road code for 2022, more or less. I'm simplifying somewhat. Before go live, there will be a process of looking at those values, those speed limits, and saying, are there any adjustments required? Do we need to change anything? And that will happen before 2022. And the authority is, and we'll talk a little bit more in this presentation about how that process of reviewing those values and setting them will occur. The authority has also said in the code, and it's hardwired this in the proposed code, if RTP is adopted, then it will undertake to review those values at least every 5 years, so that they remain current and can take account of changes to technology or other things that are relevant. Setting the values is obviously important. The fundamental thing to bear in mind, and there's more detail on this in Appendix F of the consultation paper. The fundamental thing is that the process that's envisaged for setting them is essentially the process that was used back in 2011. And if we just talk a little bit more about what that was, there were two different approaches that were used to come to those values. One was to look at it from the perspective of essentially if one is in an energy deficit, for example, what is the cost that that's imposing on parties who are being forced to go without power? Bearing in mind, an energy deficit, by definition, is forced power cuts. These are not voluntary response cuts. These are, I didn't expect that the power was going to go out in this room in the next 5 seconds. Let's hope that doesn't happen. What is the cost were that to happen? The second method is to look at the issue from the other end of the telescope and say, well, we have a view about, we don't expect 100% reliability. If we were to try and build the system to achieve 100%, no one in the world does that. The cost would be so great that we wouldn't get to drive cars or live in houses. Everything would be dedicated to that one objective. So we have a view about what a economic reliability standard is, which implies a certain number of hours of forced energy power cuts. We also have a view on an economic standard about the number of hours of instantaneous reserve shortfall we would expect. Taking that information and knowing what it costs to provide last resort resources, we can come to a view about what would you have to believe these scarcity values need to be for those last resort providers to actually just break even. So it's, if you like, a supply-driven view of the numbers versus a consumer-driven view of the numbers. And both of those approaches were used in 2011, and that general approach is what's envisaged to be used again going forward. And then there are a number of cross-checks, and the two that we used last time round, which again envisaged at this point would be used again. One is using market data. We have some information from studies on what we think the cost of curtailment is to consumers, but we also have bid data, and increasing the amount of bid data through time about what people require in order to voluntarily reduce demand. And then there are values that are used in similar studies, because this is not an issue that's unique to New Zealand. Other markets have the same issue and go about estimating those values in a similar way. The authority intends to consult on the method that it will use to set those values and the initial values before 2022, and then every 5 years at least. Important to recognise that these values, as was the case in 2011, they're likely to produce different numbers, the consumer-driven value versus the supplier-driven value, but they tend to overlap, and that's what we would expect will likely be the case when the work is done again. An important thing to bear in mind is that those values, you need to see them as a package. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, for example, for it's to set the value that would apply during forced power cuts in a way that gave very inconsistent results with the values for instantaneous reserve shortfalls. There is a relationship between those two you would expect to see, and so it's about finding a set of values that produces an internally consistent result and matches what we can see in terms of market data and other information sources. And I think it's also important, and this was very much the case back in 2011, there's quite a degree, there is science in this, but there is also quite a heavy degree of judgment that needs to be overlaid. Hence the process of engagement is very important. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. No, happy to.
is the plan for, Andrew from PowerCo, is the plan for the scarcity values to be constant through time, so through the year, through months? And the reason I ask is that we're doing planning to do some consultation with consumers to sort of get a higher degree of resolution so we can manage planned outages better, because losing power has different values to you at different times of day and month, depending on the nature of your business and your consumption. I realise the wholesale market's a slightly different scale to a sort of a small region, but the principle still holds, so that's why I'm asking.
And I can see Justin he's happy for me to, okay. I think the short answer is it's probably a good question to ask the authority nearer to 2022. What I would, as a personal observation, I guess, and again, this is partly reflecting having been involved in the 2011 exercise, and in fact you were involved in the 2011 exercise when we were working together on it. But there is always a trade-off between, if you like, granularity and workability, and so I'm sure that general issue will apply next time round as well. I think Justin's going to add something.
I would just say the short answer is yes, they would be fixed, but it's an interesting point, and that might be something for future refinements. I mean, after all, this is just trying to build a framework that then we can then expand on and refine over time. And then the other point to make is, particularly for the sort of the headline energy scarcity pricing values, bear in mind they're only applied by default. So we would hope that purchasers over time, again with new technologies coming along to make this more and more available, that you might be motivated to, if you don't like those scarcity pricing values, to tell us what your maximum willingness to pay is and bid that into the market. And that would just improve the granularity of the information that we have. But yeah, it's an interesting point. It's certainly out of scope at the moment, but it'd be good to consider down the line.
Very good. If there's no questions online, I think Justin's next up.